Hello, my name's John Holmes Carrington, and I will be your host today for this webinar from OI2 Lab. The topic of today's webinar is collaboration across long distances. The aim of this webinar will be to help you to ensure that any cultural and communication issues do not hinder a successful partnership when collaborating with multiple nations and multiple partners on a project. The objectives of the webinar today is broken down into three areas, and it'll help you understand the why, the how, and what to do next. Why effective communication is particularly important with partners have different company cultures or business backgrounds. How to make sure that you've considered the areas where communication might be an issue, and then what to do next to ensure that your project runs smoothly. The purpose of OI2 Lab is to promote collaboration on open innovation across borders. And with any project and with any program that involves a number of partners, the only way to successfully succeed is to prepare a plan in advance. And when you think that communication might be an easy part of that plan, it's very easy to get things wrong. It's very easy to misunderstand cultural needs and cultural differences. And it's very easy, in many cases, to offend. The best way to avoid doing this is to actually have an effective communication plan built into your project, along with all the other milestones that you might have in that project to enable a successful delivery. This is particularly important when you have partners who are hundreds of miles away, different time zones, and different areas of the world where words have and can mean different things. An interesting statistic carried out by the Project Management Institute looked at a lot of the ways that projects fail. And their key finding was that 43% of project managers responding said that communication issues were a major factor in the failure of their projects. You can do all the best work that you can do as part of a project to ensure the milestones of what you're actually doing is successful. But with the inability to communicate between the organizations successfully, that project would be doomed to failure. So then, what are the effects of poor communication? What difficulties can they lead to within your project? Firstly, everybody has to be aware of the challenges of communication across long distances. And everybody, all the partners in the project, have to understand that they need to keep these areas in mind. These areas include things like misunderstanding the overall project goals and objectives, a lack of commitment to completing the project, lower productivity, team members moving in different directions, conflict between team members, and missed deadlines. So to take each of these areas of poor communication in order, so the misunderstanding about project goals, ensure that everyone involved knows exactly what's expected of them as part of that project. Have a clear list and itemize who is responsible for what. Ensure that there's commitment from all the project members. Ensure that they're willing to engage, that they're actually all have the same objectives in mind, and that they have the same level of time and commitment that they can make to the project. Productivity areas. Ensure the areas of work within a project are evenly shared out. Make sure that all of the partners know exactly what their commitment is and how it affects the others. Team members moving in different directions. Others may have different priorities. The project may or may not be of the same level of interest to those partners within the group. And actually what you need to make sure is that all members of the partnership understand exactly what is expected of them and how that they communicate and how they contribute to all of the areas within that project. The other thing, of course, is conflict. There are sometimes even just the smallest word can be taken out of context, can be taken and can even offend. And actually what that leads to is conflict between individuals. And you'll find that the divergence between the members grows increasingly as the project continues. So as I mentioned earlier, the best thing to do is to have a simple communication plan to understand, alongside all the other activities of the project, what it is exactly that those contributors to the project have to do. When building the communication plan, consider who your partners are and the relationship that you have with them. Do you actually know who these individuals are? Have you spoken to them outside the project? Have you worked with them previously? How well did you get on with them? So understand, who are they? What are their roles? What do they actually do outside the scope of the project within their respective organizations? What do they do? What is their actual role? What are they contributing? What are their capabilities? What are their capacities for the project? And this leads into, when will they be available? You can't necessarily assume that as part of the project they'll be working on either the same time zones or even have the same amount of time as a commitment to give to the project. How are you going to communicate? What are the means that you're going to use? We'll talk in a little bit about some of the ways that you can communicate. But just because you've got fantastic broadband connectivity where you are, doesn't mean that a partner somewhere else will have a similar capability. You may be relying on a mixture of technologies. You may be relying on a mixture of abilities to use that technology. Also, with that, to agree upon what is the type of format. How are you going to communicate? Is it going to be verbal? Is it going to be written? Is it going to be by some other method? So as part of the communication plan, you need to outline and have detail on each of these areas. Establish a frequency. How often are you going to communicate? Where and when are you going to be able to meet? What is the purpose of that communication? As I mentioned, there are a number of different technologies that can be employed to communicate globally. A lot of the world these days has access to reasonable communication technology using an electronic means, but don't assume that this is always the case wherever all the members are. And things may work at different rates and different speeds. And they may also be, subject to, for example, weather conditions, which may or may affect the ability of that technology to function. There's also not necessarily the same agreed cost. It may be easy for you where you are to just log on, click, and you're connected as part of an all-on deal. But actually, in some areas of the world, they may be charged for the amount of time that they use for that technology. However, electronic technology is a really good way of communicating. For example, you could use a virtual meeting. You could use tools such as Skype or WebEx or NetMeeting. This way enables you to either have a speedy, almost instant communication, or even you can do it face-to-face. Some of the technologies that there are available allow video conferencing with multiple partners. But again, just bear in mind the broadband or the bandwidth capability of the technology that they and you are using. Collaboration portals. These are third-party areas where people can share documents, they can share files, they can share images, they can share notes, sometimes in real time, so that people can actually work around the world on the same document at the same time. This is also particularly useful where there are multiple versions of documents as the project evolves. You can always ensure that you're actually working on the latest version of the document that you need to be working on, and that everybody is working on the same version at the same time. rather than someone having an outdated version and realize that they're actually been left behind on the project. Instant messaging service is also very useful. Even just a basic SMS texting service can just be a really effective way to send quick, easy communication. Again, just be aware that text messaging can be misconstrued. It's very difficult to convey communication, to convey emotion. And actually, just be careful when you're sending the messages to ensure that any language you're using is non-confrontational, but also from the point of view that it can't be misconstrued. Similarly, with email, again, a messaging service involving text, graphics, and images that you can share. But again, when reading it, check the tone of your message. Ensure that you haven't put something in there that somebody else may read and they may find offensive. So just be careful when you're communicating on a, if you like, a time-delayed system, either the email or the instant messaging, that actually the tone and message of that communication is appropriate. Also be aware that in some countries, access to messages about themselves are a right, and that they can actually download or ask for a download of the content of those messages at any time. So ensure that anything that's in there, you do want them to be able to read. Another increasingly used communication method these days is remote conferencing, using either video conferencing or just audio. It is like being in the room with the person. You're on real time, you're all in the same space, albeit virtually, at the same time. Again, just be aware that sometimes it's difficult to convey what's going on in the background, but actually this is a really good tool, again, some subject to communication availability, for partners to collaborate on a project as if they were in a meeting together. So let's just have a quick recap of what we've covered. Communication is key. Don't let your project fail because of poor communication. Avoid issues. Poor communication can seriously hinder your project. Plan for success. A communication plan will help everyone be clear about how to share information. And use technology as a tool. These are all really useful, but the one thing to bear in mind with all of this is that actually there are some very important cultural differences between you and your collaborators online. What might mean something where you are might mean something completely different in another area of the world. One particular example is the American use of a thumb and finger in a circle to mean, okay, great. In other areas of the world, that can be extremely offensive, as it refers to and tells someone that you think they're nothing. Don't automatically assume that what you use where you are is what somebody else would use somewhere else in the world. Also be aware of content that you're using, that you're sharing. Again, images may be deemed suitable where you are, but may be deemed offensive of where your collaborator is based. There may well be religious or cultural references within images that others may find offensive or that others may find difficult to understand. In all of your communications, try to avoid ambiguity. Try to avoid using language which uses colloquialisms. You may understand a particular phrase where you are, but actually just because you understand it doesn't mean that the collaborator and the partner you're working with will understand it further around the world. Try to use straightforward language. Try to use language that is easy to understand. You may think you're being patronizing, but actually it's far better for everybody to understand what they're talking about than to somebody as part of that project to feel as though they're missed out because they didn't understand the idiom or the colloquialism behind the language. Also bear in mind that you may well be communicating in a language that's not your collaborator's first language. There are many areas of the world that do successfully speak English, and obviously for the purpose of this webinar, that's the language that we're using. But don't assume that that's an individual's first language, and don't automatically assume their level of competence with that language. Sometimes even just making an effort to try and learn a bit of a language of a partner that you're working with will make so much difference to the ability that you have to communicate. If you can understand what it's like as part of that communication from their point of view, you much better understand how easy it will be for you to use a different kind of language with them. If you have any further questions or you want more information about this webinar or the content in it, you can get hold of the members of the OI2 Lab using the following communication tools. This webinar will be made available on the OI2 Lab portal, and you can download it to view at your leisure at a later date. Thank you very much.